The house was quiet in the particular way that only guilt can make a house quiet, and Chidinma sat up in bed at 2 in the morning with her phone throwing pale light across her face, her thumb frozen mid-scroll over a photograph she had already seen 3 times and still could not make herself believe. In the picture, her husband of 12 years, Obiora, stood beneath a canopy of white and gold balloons, a christening gown draped over his forearm, his face arranged into the soft, proud smile of a man holding something he loved. Beside him stood a woman Chidinma had never met, her hand resting on his back with the ease of long familiarity, and beneath the photo, in looping cursive font, the caption read, "My everything, my forever, our miracle finally has a name." Chidinma read it again, and again. She did not cry, she did not wake him. She simply lay very still, listening to Obiora breathe beside her, a man she had cooked for that evening, whose shirts she had ironed that morning, whose forehead she had kissed before he left for what he called a business trip to Onitsha, and she understood, with a calm that frightened her more than tears would have, that she did not know this man at all. If you have ever discovered a truth so large it rearranged the furniture of your entire life without moving a single object in the room, you already understand why Chidinma did not scream. Before we go further, if this story moves you, stay until the end. There is a reckoning coming, and you will not want to miss how it lands. Now, let's continue. Everyone who knew Obiora had an explanation for why he was such a good husband. At church, he was the man who stayed behind after service to help elderly members find their cars. When a widow's rent was due, Obiora somehow found the money. When a young man in the congregation needed school fees, Obiora quietly paid them, and even Chidinma had once used those things to defend him. Only 2 months earlier, at her cousin's wedding, an aunt had leaned toward Chidinma during the reception and said, half in jest, that a man that generous outside his house must be even sweeter inside it, and Chidinma had laughed and said, "You have no idea," and meant it, and everyone at the table had laughed with her. Obiora is a good man, she had told her older sister, Nkemdirim, more than once, usually when Nkemdirim raised an eyebrow at some new absence or some new excuse, because Nkemdirim had never fully trusted a man who prayed that beautifully in front of other people. Now, sitting in the darkness with Amarachi's photograph glowing on her phone, Chidinma remembered every time she had said those words, and suddenly one detail bothered her more than all the others put together. Obiora had never once allowed anyone from church to visit the apartment he supposedly used whenever he traveled. Not once. In 12 years. Whenever someone asked where he stayed during those trips, he gave a different answer. A hotel, a friend's house, a supplier's guest apartment, and Chidinma had never questioned it, because there had never seemed to be a reason to, until tonight. She opened her banking app, then her calendar, then the photograph again. The date beneath the christening picture was 14 days old. Chidinma checked her calendar. It was the same weekend Obiora had told her he was in Onitsha meeting a supplier, the same weekend he had called her at 9 in the evening to say goodnight to the girls, his voice warm and unhurried, not a single note in it that suggested he was calling from inside a house that was not his real one. Her breathing changed. She opened the next photograph on the woman's page, a wedding cake, gold lettering, MR and MRS. Obiora, dated 3 years earlier. The same December Obiora had told her he was traveling up-country for his mother's anniversary, a trip Chidinma remembered clearly because she had packed his bag herself, folding his shirts the way he liked, tucking in a small bottle of the cologne she had bought him for Valentine's Day. Chidinma's fingers finally began to tremble. She stared at the screen, and then she whispered the question that would change everything. "How many times did you bury me while I was still alive?" The deeper she searched, the more frightening the truth became. This was not an affair. It was an operation. She found the second phone number first, saved under a contact name she did not recognize in an old, forgotten backup of his phone she had once helped him restore. Then the apartment, its address embedded quietly in a delivery confirmation email he had forgotten to delete. Then the account from which the rent had been paid, a business account Chidinma had always assumed was for his supply contracts. But the thing that made her sit back from the phone entirely was a photograph, posted years earlier by a cousin of Amarachi's and tagged carelessly, of Obiora's identification card lying on a table at what looked like an introduction ceremony. The face was his, the date of birth was his, but the surname printed beneath it was not the surname she had carried for 12 years. Chidinma remembered, then, the evening 3 years ago, when Obiora had come home from one of his supposed business trips and told her he had lost his wallet somewhere between Onitsha and Lagos. She had helped him replace his bank cards, sitting beside him at the kitchen table while he filled out the forms, and she had even laughed when he said, "At least my wife knows everything about me," kissing her forehead as he said it. She had believed him so completely that she had never once wondered why a man who had lost his wallet had not also needed to replace his identification card. Because, she understood now, he had never actually lost it. He had simply needed a quiet week to have a second one made. She searched further and found messages between Obiora and Amarachi going back almost 3 years, preserved on an old device Amarachi had once used and later sold. Its contents somehow still cached and indexed online in a way Chidinma did not fully understand and did not care to. In one, Amarachi had written, "I still can't believe God gave me a second chance at marriage," and Obiora had replied, "You deserve happiness after everything you've been through." Chidinma's stomach tightened. She kept scrolling until she found the message that explained why Amarachi had never once suspected her existence. "Sometimes I wish I could meet your first wife and thank her for letting you move on," Amarachi had written, one ordinary Tuesday evening, the kind of sentence a woman writes when she is simply grateful and has no idea she is standing on a lie. Obiora's reply was 3 words: "She passed away." Chidinma stopped breathing, not because the lie surprised her, but because of how easily he had written it. No hesitation, no explanation, no guilt, no pause, even long enough for a decent man's conscience to catch up with his fingers. Just 3 words that had erased 12 years of her life in the time it took to type them. And suddenly she understood something worse than infidelity. Obiora had not been hiding another woman. He had been living as another man. For the next 7 days, Chidinma behaved as though nothing had happened, and that was the hardest part. She served Obiora his breakfast, the same way she had for 12 years, eggs soft the way he liked them, plantain sliced thin. She asked about his meetings, and listened to his answers with the same attentiveness she always had, nodding at the right places. She ironed the cream agbada he planned to wear to the church's anniversary service, running the iron slowly over the gold embroidery, thinking, as she did, that this was the last time her hands would ever prepare something for him to be admired in. At night she lay beside him while he slept, but now she was watching, and Obiora, without knowing it, gave her something she had not expected. He lied again, right in front of her, live, uncoached, easy as breathing. On the 4th evening he came home late, loosening his tie as he walked through the door. "Meeting ran over," he said, dropping his car keys into the bowl by the entrance. "With who?" she asked, keeping her voice light, curious, the voice of a wife who asks such questions out of habit rather than suspicion. He paused, only for half a second, a pause so small that a week earlier she would never have noticed it. "Chief Eze," he said. She nodded, and told him his food was in the warmer, and went into the bathroom and searched the name on her phone with the tap running so he would not hear the search bar chime. Chief Eze, it turned out, had traveled to London for a health checkup 2 weeks prior and had posted, that very afternoon, a photograph of himself outside a hospital in Camden. Chidinma turned off the tap, dried her hands, and returned to the bedroom without a single word, understanding now, with total clarity, that she was no longer investigating the past. She was watching him lie to her in real time, calmly, skillfully, the way a man lies who has done it so often it no longer registers to him as lying at all. It was this, more than anything else, that hardened her decision. She would not confront him yet. She had considered it. She had imagined, more than once, throwing the phone at his chest and demanding an explanation. But each time, she made herself sit back down. She thought about calling Nkemdirim, and one evening she almost did, her thumb hovering over her sister's name in her contacts before she put the phone face down on the table instead. Not yet, she told herself, because she knew exactly what would happen if she told Nkemdirim too soon. Her sister would want to march to the second house herself, would want to scream in the street, would turn Chidinma's careful, quiet unraveling into a public spectacle before Chidinma was ready for it to be one. She needed to know one more thing first, something more important than her own anger, whether Amarachi was his accomplice or his second victim. She created an anonymous account, using a stock photograph she found online and a name that meant nothing, and opened Amarachi's profile. "I think we need to talk about Obiora," she typed, her thumb hovering over send for a long time before she finally pressed it, watching the little indicator show that the message had been delivered, then seen. 3 minutes later, Amarachi replied, "Who are you?" "I am his wife," Chidinma wrote back, and then, before she could stop herself, added, "His first wife, 12 years. "What wife?" came the answer, followed immediately by, "Please, I don't understand," and then, a few seconds later, "Is this a joke? Because it isn't funny," and then, "Please answer me." Chidinma read the confusion pouring out of the other woman's messages, unpolished, unrehearsed, nothing like the careful denials of someone caught in a scheme, and for the first time since finding the photograph, Chidinma began to cry. Not for herself, but for the woman on the other side of the screen, who was, at that very moment, discovering that her entire marriage rested on nothing at all. By midnight, Amarachi had sent 11 photographs, unprompted, as though she needed to hold each one up and ask, "Does this look like a lie to you?" The wedding, the hospital, the family portrait taken at 6 months pregnant, a picture of Obiora holding their newborn son with the particular tenderness of a man who has waited a long time for a child, though Chidinma knew, bitterly, that he already had 2 daughters at home who had waited just as long for that same tenderness and rarely received it. Then came something else. "I found this in the file where Obiora kept our marriage documents," Amarachi wrote. "I thought it was just paperwork from his first marriage, something the lawyer told him to keep." Attached was a scanned image. Chidinma opened it and felt the room tilt. It was a death certificate. The woman's name on it was hers, her full name, spelled correctly, her date of birth exact, even her father's correct name listed as next of kin, but the date of death was 6 years earlier, and the cause listed was a motor accident on the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway. Chidinma sat with the phone in her lap for a long moment, unable to type anything at all, staring at a document that declared her dead, while she sat very much alive in the bed she shared with the man who had apparently arranged her death on paper so that he could marry someone else with a clean conscience. For a long moment neither woman typed anything, and then Amarachi sent, "He told my parents you died in a car accident," and then, he even cried when he told the story. "He said he still visited your grave sometimes, and I told him it was okay. I told him I understood. I told him grief takes time." Chidinma felt something inside her go completely cold, colder even than the night she had first seen the photograph. This was bigger than cheating. Obiora had not simply lied to Amarachi. He had manufactured a dead woman, forged the paperwork to prove it, invented a grave he must have visited alone or perhaps never visited at all, and built an entire history around Chidinma's disappearance while she was still in his house, raising his children, ironing his clothes, waiting up for him with his food warm. "What are we going to do?" Amarachi asked, finally, after a long silence. Chidinma looked across the bedroom at Obiora, asleep and peaceful, one arm thrown loosely over the pillow, as though the lives of two women hadn't been built, brick by careful brick, around his lies. "We're going to make sure he can never tell another lie about either of us," she typed back. "How?" Amarachi asked. Chidinma looked at the church anniversary invitation sitting on her bedside table, its gold lettering catching the little light from her phone, and, for the first time in 2 weeks, she smiled, a small, cold, satisfied smile that would have frightened Obiora if he had been awake to see it. "At church," she wrote. The plan itself was simple in outline, even if the two women spent the following days refining every detail of it late into the night. The truth would come out in the very place Obiora had built his reputation, because a lie exposed in private could still be managed, apologized for, buried under tears and promises, but a lie exposed in front of the people whose respect he had spent 12 years cultivating could not be managed at all. But Chidinma knew he was good at talking. She had watched him talk his way out of smaller things for over a decade, so they needed a small number of things he could not talk his way around, not a case file thick enough to bore a congregation, but 4 pieces sharp enough to cut through any explanation he tried to offer. The wedding photograph, gold letters and all. The christening program, with his name printed plainly beside Amarachi's for a son the church congregation didn't know existed. The forged death certificate, bearing Chidinma's own name and face-adjacent details. And one record of the apartment itself, the electricity bill, and the internet account, both in Obiora's name, with the child's school correspondence delivered to that same address, proof that this was not a hidden fling conducted in hotel rooms, but an entire second household, paid for, maintained, lived in. 3 days before the anniversary service, something went wrong. Obiora came home earlier than usual, his footsteps in the hallway lighter and quicker than his normal tired evening walk, and found Chidinma at the dining table with her phone in her hand, the folder of evidence open in a browser tab she closed a half-second too slowly. "Who are you talking to?" he asked, hanging his jacket on the back of a chair. "My sister," she said, keeping her eyes on the screen. He nodded, but did not leave the room, standing there instead, studying her face for several seconds, in a way he had not studied her in years, before he spoke again. "You've been different lately," he said quietly. "Different how?" she asked, her heartbeat rising, though her face gave nothing away. "Like you're waiting for something," he answered, tilting his head slightly, and for one terrifying moment, Chidinma wondered if he already knew, if some instinct, honed by years of managing 2 lives, had picked up the scent of his own unraveling. Then he shrugged, as though deciding it wasn't worth pursuing, and walked toward the bedroom. Chidinma waited until she heard the door close before she let herself exhale, her hands shaking now for the first time in 2 weeks. She messaged Amarachi immediately. "He suspects something." "Then we don't wait," Amarachi replied within seconds. The anniversary was still 3 days off, but suddenly, 3 days felt far too long to wait with a man who was starting, however dimly, to smell danger in his own house. The church was already full when Chidinma arrived, the parking attendants waving cars into tight, careful rows, the choir's rehearsal drifting faintly through the open doors. She sat beside Obiora in the second row, while he greeted people on either side, shook hands, laughed with the elders, completely at ease, a man entirely secure in a life he did not know was about to end. At one point he leaned toward her and whispered, "You look beautiful," a sentence that would have warmed her 12 years earlier and now sounded like a man speaking from behind glass, his voice reaching her, but nothing behind it landing. Near the back, in a pale blue dress chosen deliberately because it would not draw attention until attention was exactly what was needed, sat Amarachi, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Their eyes met across the sanctuary. Amarachi gave the smallest nod. She was ready. Chidinma tried to listen to the service, and could not. Every time Obiora stood to sing, his voice rich and confident among the congregation, she watched his face instead of the hymn sheet. Every time someone leaned over to praise him, his generosity, his faithfulness, his example to the younger men, she thought of the forged death certificate sitting in her handbag, thought of her own name typed beside a stranger's date of death. Then the pastor rose for his sermon, and chose of all mornings to preach on faithfulness. Faithfulness, he said, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the sanctuary, is not what we claim in public. It is who we are when nobody is watching. A faithful man does not build one life in the light and call it enough, while building another in darkness and calling it necessary. Beside her, Obiora's smile finally disappeared. He glanced sideways at Chidinma. She was looking straight ahead, her hands folded, her face unreadable. The pastor called the honorees forward, one by one, for a brief word of recognition before the offering. Obiora Nwosu, he announced, and the congregation applauded warmly as Obiora rose, adjusted his agbada, and walked toward the altar with the easy, practiced confidence of a man who had done this many times and expected to do it many times more. The pastor placed a hand on his shoulder and began, "This man has shown us what faithfulness looks like." And it was in the small pause after these words, in the breath before the applause could rise again, that Chidinma stood. "Pastor," she said, her voice carrying further than she expected. The applause died instantly. Obiora turned, his face changing in the space of a single heartbeat, confidence draining out of it the way water drains from a cracked basin. "Chidinma," he said. She lifted the folder in her hands, walking forward already. "May I say something?" she asked the pastor, "since my husband has just been praised for his faithfulness." "No," Obiora said quickly, stepping toward her. The first time all morning he had sounded afraid, the first crack in 12 years of composure. Chidinma walked toward the altar anyway, unhurried, and behind her, at the back of the sanctuary, Amarachi rose from her pew. Several heads turned to follow her, as she began to walk forward too. The sanctuary went completely silent, the kind of silence that has weight, that presses against the ears. 3 years ago, my husband married another woman, Chidinma said, her voice steady. A murmur moved through the congregation like wind passing through dry grass. He told her I was dead. Obiora shook his head, reaching for her arm. "Chidinma, please." And he did not simply tell her I was dead, she continued, stepping just out of his reach. She opened the folder. He created proof. Amarachi stepped forward from the aisle, her hands trembling, but her voice clear. "He gave me this," she said, raising the forged death certificate above her head so the front rows could see it. "He told me this was the woman he had lost." She turned then and looked directly at Obiora for the first time since she had entered the building. "But she is standing right there." The pastor took the certificate from her hands, his own hands unsteady now, and read the name printed on it, then looked from Chidinma to Obiora and back again, his face moving through disbelief toward something harder. "How long have you maintained this second family?" he asked, his voice no longer the warm, measured voice of a sermon, but something closer to a demand. Obiora looked at the floor, at his own polished shoes, anywhere but at the hundreds of faces now watching him. 3 years, he said, barely above a whisper. "And your wife?" the pastor asked. "And how long have you been married to her?" Obiora closed his eyes. 12 years, he said. The 2 numbers landed on the congregation like twin stones dropped into still water. 3 secret years nested entirely inside 12 years everyone had believed were whole, every Sunday lunch and paid school fee and prayer, with his eyes closed now cast in a different light, every kindness suddenly suspect, every generous gesture recolored, as the careful maintenance of a reputation built on sand. A woman in the congregation gasped. Someone near the back shouted, "Jesus!" An elder who had known Obiora for 15 years sat down heavily in his pew, his hand pressed to his own chest. The pastor stepped back from Obiora, as though physical distance could undo the endorsement he had just given him, his disgust no longer hidden at all. The church erupted into noise, voices rising over each other, someone weeping loudly near the front, an usher moving instinctively toward the doors as though to prevent anyone from leaving before this finished. But Chidinma was not watching any of it. She was watching her daughters, seated where she had left them in the second row. Zina, 16, was crying without trying to hide it, her hands pressed over her mouth. Amaka, 13, was not crying at all. She was simply staring at her father, with an expression Chidinma had never seen on her daughter's face before, something between disbelief and the beginning of a much older, harder kind of understanding. Chidinma walked back to them and knelt in the aisle beside their pew, taking both their hands. "We're going home," she whispered. Obiora, following her, reached for her arm again. "Chidinma, please," he said, his voice cracking now, 12 years of composed charm finally failing him completely. She stepped back, out of his reach a second time. "No," she said. The first word she had spoken to him all morning that was not carefully measured, not chosen for its evidentiary weight, simply true. No more explanations. Then she took her daughter's hands, one in each of hers, and walked them up the aisle and out through the wide double doors into the overcast morning light, leaving Obiora standing alone at the altar where, for 12 years, he had built a reputation he had just watched collapse in less than 4 minutes. 3 weeks later, Obiora returned home from a church he no longer felt welcome in, to a house that no longer sounded like a home. He noticed it before he even opened the door. No radio playing faintly from the kitchen, no smell of food, none of the ordinary evidence of a family still living its ordinary life. Inside, Zina's shoes were gone from the rack by the door, Amaka's school bag was gone from its hook in the hallway, Chidinma's perfume bottles, 3 of them, always lined up neatly on the bathroom shelf, were gone, leaving 3 faint, dust-free circles behind on the glass. On the dining table, in the center, exactly where Chidinma used to leave his food covered under a plate, sat a single envelope. He opened it standing up, still in his good shoes, and found the divorce papers inside, already signed on her side, waiting only for his signature to make official what had already, in every way that mattered, already happened. For the first time in 12 years, there was no woman waiting anywhere in that house to hear whatever explanation he might have prepared, and no explanation, he realized, standing alone in the too quiet dining room, had ever actually been prepared, because he had never once imagined needing one. Word of the exposure moved through the church and beyond it, faster than Obiora could have controlled, even at the height of his powers. His business partners, hearing the story second-hand and then confirmed, grew quietly distant, unwilling to be associated with a man whose word, the very currency he had built his reputation and his business on, had been proven worthless in the most public way possible. The elders who had once called him forward for honor now called him forward for a different kind of meeting entirely, one that ended with his name, quietly removed from the usher's roster and, not long after, from the membership rolls altogether. Amarachi, for her part, freed from a marriage that had never been legally valid in the first place, moved forward with the support of a community of women in her own church, who rallied around her once her innocence became unmistakable, and began, slowly, to rebuild a life that had been built on a foundation she now understood had never existed. Chidinma and Amarachi did not become close friends in the way films sometimes imagine such stories ending, meeting for coffee every week, laughing together at what they'd survived. They remained, from that day forward, something quieter and more durable than friendship. Two women who had been wronged by the same architecture of lies, and who had chosen, together, at real cost to themselves, to bring it down rather than let it stand for even one more anniversary service. Obiora had wanted two families because he believed, in whatever quiet arrogance let him build the second life brick by careful brick, that he could control two versions of reality indefinitely, keeping each one ignorant of the other forever. But reality, Chidinma came to understand, does not remain divided forever. Eventually the doors open, the names meet, the photographs are compared, the dates line up, the lies find each other in the dark and recognize themselves for what they are. And the man who thought he had built two separate lives discovered, in the space of one church service, that he had actually built one enormous trap and stepped into it himself. Chidinma never forgot the night she found that photograph, the phone light on her face at 2 a.m, the christening gown draped over Obiora's arm. But years later, when she thought back on all of it, she would remember something else even more clearly than the discovery itself. Not the woman beside Obiora, not the child in his arms, not even the forged certificate bearing her own name and a stranger's date of death. She would remember the moment she stood in that church, folder in hand, and realized that losing the man she had married was not, in fact, the greatest loss she could have suffered that year. The greatest loss would have been losing herself, quietly, over years, trying to protect a lie that was never hers to protect in the first place. And that was the one thing Obiora, for all his careful planning, his forged documents, his 2 calendars, and 2 households, and 2 versions of himself, could never take from her: her truth, her dignity, and her voice. If this story reminded you that the truth, however long delayed, always finds its way into the light, do not scroll past without sharing it with someone who needs to hear that patience is not the same as weakness. And if you believe, as Chidinma came to believe, that dignity is worth more than a quiet false peace, let this be the story you return to the next time silence feels safer than truth.